In today's video, I'll be talking about vintage computers versus modern computers, price and power comparisons. So back in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, computers were a novelty and they were pretty expensive. So at the top left, you see a TRS 80 Model 4. And the specs for that is came with a Zilog Z80A CPU, and it has a speed of 4 megahertz, and that's equivalent. That's about 0.58 MIPS. It's called MIPS is a million instructions per second. So that's how many instructions a Zilog Z80A can execute in 1 second. And the memory that it came with was either 64 kbytes of RAM or 128 kbytes of RAM. And that is about roughly 128 kbytes of RAM is about 0.128 megabytes. That's not a lot of memory. And it came with two 64 kbyte floppy disk drives. So each floppy disk drive could hold about 64 kbytes of RAM or memory. The price was about $1,999 back in 1983. And if you compare that to today's price with inflation and everything, $1 back in 1982 was equivalent to $3.08 today in today's money. So basically, if it would have about, if you bought it at $1,999 back in 1982 or 1983, it would have about $6,156.92 worth of purchasing value in today's money. So that's inflation adjusted prices. And the next thing I have is a Commodore 64. When it was introduced back in 1982, it didn't come with a floppy disk drive. Just the computer itself was about $595 back in 1982. And if you wanted to get a floppy disk drive, that would cost you about $399 for the floppy disk drive. So if you wanted to get one with a floppy disk drive, it would cost you $994 back in 1982. And in today's price, at $994, it'd be $3,061.52. That's how much purchasing power that it would have back in, today, if you compare it with today's money. And it was roughly had the same amount of power as a TRX Model 4. It came with a MOS technology 6510 or MOS technology 8500 CPU or microprocessor. It was capable of 0.43 million instructions per second. That's how many instructions it could do in a second. Came with about 64 kbytes of RAM. Had a 5.25 inch floppy disk drive at 170 kbytes, which is more than the TRS 80, which had two 64 kbyte floppy disk drives. So it was about half the price of a TRS 80 Model 4. And Commodore was known for producing inexpensive computers. Probably one of the most inexpensive computers in the computer market back in the 1980s. And then you have the Apple IIc, which was released in 1984. And it came with a WDC 653C02 microprocessor running at 1.023 megahertz or 0.43 MIPS or million instructions per second. That's how much it could execute. And surprisingly, these old CPUs are still used for industrial applications, like the WDC 65C02 CPUs are still produced for industrial uses. Surprisingly, after like over not 40 years, 38 years, it's still used, which is incredible because industrial computers just have to do simple tasks, So they don't have to be powerful or anything. They just have to do something like when a object drops from a conveyor belt, it's got to stamp something at a specific time. It's all timed. The conveyor belt is timed and everything moves at a constant speed, and the stamping thing just stamps at a certain time. So, or whatever the machine. That's how it's used in industrial applications. But I digress. I'm not talking about that today. So basically, the Apple IIc was a pretty compact little computer. I still have one today. It had a carrying case handle thing, and you could just carry it. It's a pretty small, compact computer at that time. It's definitely thicker than my laptop. It's pretty heavy too, comparatively. Let's see how much it weighed. Trying to find out. Apple IIc weighed about 7.5 pounds, which was not a lot of weight. And the thing came with a floppy disk drive, 140 kbytes, memory of 128 kbytes. It's an 8-bit computer with an 8-bit processor. The price was about $1,295 retail. That's without tax in 1984. And $1 in 1984 is equivalent to $1.86 today. So this computer would have, at that price of $1,295, would have a purchasing power of $2,408.70. You could see. And then the Commodore 1000 was released in 1985. That is a 16-bit computer, significantly more powerful than the 8-bit computer. So it came with a CPU called Motorola 6800 at 7.16 megahertz. I think it's a 32-bit CPU running on a 16-bit bus. So we could say that it's a 16-bit computer. And it could execute about 2.5 million instructions per second, which is significantly more powerful than the 8-bit CPUs that I mentioned earlier. About 5 times more powerful than an 8-bit processor. Had 256 kbytes of RAM. And later, when the Amiga 500 was released, it came up with about 512 megabytes of RAM. 512 kbytes of RAM, not megabytes. Storage was about 3.5-inch floppy disk at 880 kbytes. And at this time, computers did not really come with hard drives. Hard drives were very expensive. They did exist, but that would bring up the cost of the computer significantly, because those storage devices were very expensive back in the early 1980s to the mid 1980s. So the price of this Amiga 1000 was about $1,285 back in 1985, and $1 back in 1985 had a purchasing power of $1.77 today. So the purchasing power of that computer at that time would be $2,274.45 today. Okay, that's a lot of money. But as you can see, the price is steadily going down from, I guess, 1982. TRS-80, the first model, was released in, I think, 1978 or 79. So it's very expensive because it was one of the first personal computers, and also the Apple IIe was one of the first personal computers released into the market. And that was also pretty expensive. And as you can see, the price is dropping as time goes by, right? And we have the IBM PS2 Model 80. That was released in 1988. It was quite an expensive computer, as all IBM PCs were. So it came with an Intel 386SX 16 megahertz processor, and it could execute about 2 million instructions per second. Came with about 1 megabyte of RAM. Storage was about 44. It had a 44 megabyte hard drive, and it had a 3.5-inch floppy disk drive, 1.44 megabytes. Price was $6,995 back in 1988. And $1 in 1984 is equivalent to $1.51 today. So the purchasing power of that computer of $6,995 would be equivalent to $10,562.45 today, which was quite expensive. And but IBM didn't really keep their monopoly position for very long, because some computer engineers figured out how to make use the BIOS chip, use the BIOS technology to create their own IBM clones, right? And you had many different brands coming into the market producing clones, like AST, you had Compaq, you had Compudyne, you had Leading Edge, and all these other companies were producing IBM compatibles. And the price of IBM compatibles was almost half the price of a real IBM, or even less sometimes. So back in 1989, it was late 1989, maybe around December, I got my first IBM clone computer. It was called Leading Technology. That was a brand, and it came with the same processor as IBM PC PS2 Model 80. It came with a 386 processor running at 16 megahertz. Came with 1 megabyte of RAM. It came with VGA graphics. Came with a 40 megabyte hard drive. It came with a 5.1 1.22 megabyte floppy disk drive, and a 3.5-inch 1.44 megabyte floppy disk drive. And the price was roughly $2,000 back in 1989. That is including the monitor and a keyboard. They didn't have a mouse back then. I had to buy the mouse separately. and that costs roughly about $100 for a Microsoft. I think it was a bus mouse or a serial mouse. I don't remember. Maybe it was a bus mouse. It cost $100. It didn't come with a sound card. All it had was the PC speaker sound, which was monotone and which was pretty crappy. So I bought a ad-lib sound card for it, which costs about $100. And the purchasing $1 back in 1989 is equivalent to $1.40 today. So the purchasing power of $2,000 back in 1989 is equivalent to $2,800 today. So that's significantly more than what you can get today for $2,800, right? So a standard desktop PC, one that is, I guess, a mid-range PC with the i7, maybe 12,700K CPU, 32 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM, 1 terabyte SSD, 4 terabyte hard drive with a GeForce, at least a GeForce GTX 3060 12 gigabyte PCI Express graphics card, a mid-tower case with, I guess, at least 600 to 750 watt power supply, and a 24-inch OLED monitor, and the keyboard and mouse would cost you anywhere from $1,600 to $1,800 today. And I bought my computer, which was the i7 10700K F computer. It had for about, I actually put it together myself. It cost me about roughly maybe $1,300, but I had parts for it already, like other parts. Like I had the power supply, I had the case, I had the hard drives and SSDs, NVMe, M.2 NVMe SSDs and stuff like that. So I didn't quite spend $1,600 to $1,800, but if you did get all the parts and put it together yourself, or buy it from someone who builds computers or from a manufacturer, you would be expected to pay anywhere from $1,600 to $1,800 for standard desktop computers with the specs that I mentioned before. So yes, the price was more expensive for computers back then, but the computers back then had a lot less power compared to the computers of today, right? So I want to make a price and power comparison compared to a modern computer, which you can see on the top right, which says price and power compared to a modern computer. So back in 1982, a C64, a Commodore 64, if you compare it to a i7 12700K, the CPU power is 189,230.23 times less than a modern computer of the specs that I mentioned. Memory is 500,000 times less. The storage is 23.53 million times less. And the price is 1.8 times more for a Commodore 64. And if we compare it to a TRS-80 Model 4 in 1983, the CPU power is 140,291.38 times less. Memory is 250,000 times less. The storage capacity is 31.25 million times less. The price is 3.62 times more than what you can get for a computer today, right? And the Apple IIc in 1984, the CPU power is 189,230.23 times less. Memory is 250,000 less, times less. Storage is 23.53 million times less. The price is 1.42 times more. In 1985, we had the Amiga 1000. That was the CPU is 32,547.6 times less, and the memory is 125,000 times less. Storage is 4.45 million times less. The price is 1.34 times more than a modern computer. In 1988, we have a IBM PS2 Model 80, and CPU power is 40,684.5 times less. Memory is 32,000 times less. Storage is 90,909 times less. Price is 6.21 times more. And in 1989, you have the IBM clone. These, I guess, there are many types of clones, and the prices varied from manufacturer to manufacturer, but I guess the average price of an IBM clone with a 386 processor was about $2,000 to maybe $2,500, but we'll set it to $2,000 back in 1989, and CPU is 40,684.5 times less. Memory is 32,000 times less. Storage is 100,000 times less. Price is 1.65 times more. Definitely, not only should we just look at the prices, but we should look at what these old computers were capable of. You really couldn't do very much with these old computers. I remember I had an Apple IIc. I also had an IBM clone. I had a Commodore 64, which my friend sold me for about $20. And I had an Apple IIe also. And these computers were limited in what they could do. I could play some computer games on it. I did learn the basic programming language on the Apple IIc and Commodore 64. And I did learn how to program. I also learned a lot about computers just by playing with these things as well. But you really couldn't do very much with it. I didn't have a modem for it, so there's no network capacity there. You couldn't, there was no internet back in the 1980s. Couldn't use it for networking or anything. It's very limited. Of course, they did have modems for computers, but they were very expensive. And it wasn't really accessible like the internet is today for modern computers. And couldn't do very much with it. I did use it for school, for word processing. You could use it for doing spreadsheets and databases. But I was only a kid, so I wouldn't be doing anything like that. But today you could do so much more with computers. You could stream videos on it. You could watch movies on it. You could go shopping on the internet. You could do online banking. You could take classes on the internet. You could use remote desktop access to work from home, right? You can use cloud computing to work at home. You could do all these things, but you couldn't do that with these old vintage computers. So not only were they less, not only did these computers have less power, it's limited in what you could do with it. And if you just look at some of the stuff like like gaming, for example, um, games for, say, the Commodore 64, Apple IIc, Apple IIe, Amiga computers, and IBM DOS games. It looks, I mean, if you compare it to the games of today, you could clearly see a difference. Today's games are more realistic. Um, you could play with other people on the internet, right? Online. You could connect to, you could play with hundreds of people online, like some of these games like War Thunder and World of Warcraft and all these other types of games. There's so many different types you could play on the internet with other people. And you could do that back in the 1980s if you had a modem. You could play games with other people, but it's just a one-to-one thing. You could play against another person using a modem, but it's nothing like what we have today, where you can connect to a server and connect to thousands, hundreds or thousands of people and play with them, online. So if you wanted to do that back in the 1980s, you could use a modem and do that, or you could go to the arcades and play with other people. So computers are, of today, much more capable compared to the computers of the 1980s, a lot cheaper in terms of inflation adjusted prices. And we cannot live without a computer today. You can't function in society without a computer today. But back in the 1980s, it really wasn't like that. You could live without computers. You didn't need to know about computers. It just wasn't necessary. It was I guess we were entering the digital age starting from the late 1970s. It was like transitioning from the analog age to the digital age, which we live in today. I guess industries were automating jobs, yes, starting from the late 1970s to the 1980s, and this caused a lot of unemployment in Western countries as corporations and big companies started to put microcontrollers in just about every type of manufacturing machinery. They can automate an entire assembly line and reduce the number of workers, right? And that's a lot of that did happen during the 1980s, where more stuff like robotics were being used and stuff like that, and machinery was being automated in a way, and it was used a lot heavily in industry. But today, see that computers are much more capable, and people could do more stuff with it, and a lot of people do make a living from computers. They could, you see a lot of people making a living on social media with computers. You see people doing stuff like writing software and making a living off of that. Yeah. Stuff in the gig economy like rideshare, that's using a smartphone, which is a computer with a RISC processor in it. And with the internet, it's connected to the internet, and you're able to some people are able to make a living off of doing stuff like rideshare and stuff like delivery and stuff like that, using these apps and all these things. People make a living off of selling stuff on the internet, like on platforms like eBay, Amazon, Mercari, and others. Or Yes, it was very limited back in the 1980s. We didn't have stuff like social media where you could broadcast yourself on the internet and everybody could watch it if you want to do that back in the 1980s. The only way you could do that is if you went on broadcast television or something or on radio, then you could do that. But today you don't need to do that. You could just use because of the internet and computers, you could record videos, you could send messages on stuff like Twitter and Instagram and other things, and people were making a living off of that too. So a lot of jobs did get destroyed back in the 1980s and late 1970s, especially industrial jobs. But over time, a lot of jobs were created as well for because of computers, because of the internet and all this. And there's some people doing streaming video game stuff, and they're making a living off of it. And yeah, it's pretty much it. So computers today much more capable than the computers of yesteryears. A lot cheaper, a lot more available. Everybody has a computer now. Back in the 1980s, that wasn't the case. Everybody did not have computers because they were so prohibitively expensive. If, for example, in my neighborhood, I knew a couple of people there, and everybody did not have computers. Some people didn't have computers, you know, and there were so many different types of computers. Everyone had different computers. Like my neighbor Joe would have a Apple Macintosh, and my other neighbor Eric might have an IBM clone or something, and well, I had an Apple IIc or a Commodore 64, and my other friend had an Atari 800 computer. Everything was different. But now we have like a standardized format, which is a Windows, Microsoft-based Windows operating system running I guess AMD or Intel x86 or x64 based processor, and we could all connect to the internet and we could all communicate with each other. So all the platforms have gone down as well. Basically, it's been standardized. So we have more standardization today. We have lower prices. Computers are more capable, and they're more powerful. And definitely, it has improved a lot in the past 40, 42 years. So, anyways, if you want to leave any comments, you could leave them in the comments section below. And thanks